I wanted to say thank you to Stephen for setting the scene for today so nicely. As Nigel just said, my name is Martha Bicket. I'm part of the CECAN team at University of Surrey, and I'm one of the co-authors of the supplementary guide. When we first set up CECAN about 4 years ago, it was a bit of a pipe dream, but I remember us talking about how we thought it would be really impactful to be able to have something on complexity in the Magenta book. So it was really exciting when CECAN was approached and asked to produce a supplementary guide for the 2020 Magenta book update. So the result, this supplementary guide, is based on 3 years of CECAN's work, as Nigel said. It was pulled together by a multidisciplinary team. I think everyone is here, which is very nice to celebrate that today, bringing together expertise in evaluation, policy, and complex adaptive systems. But it isn't our effort alone. It's very important to say that the guide is also thanks to the input of a larger number of people. That's both the wider CECAN team and also the wider network of fellows that CECAN draws on. Also in consultation, it was developed in consultation with policy and evaluation experts in government and methods experts in the academic community. The supplementary guide is published by Treasury and accompanies the 2020 edition of the Magenta book, as you just heard, both out later this month. So what we're here to do today is to introduce our supplementary guide for you and to give you a sneak peek of what's inside. So what's happening now is we're going to introduce the supplementary guide to you and just give you a brief overview. This will be followed by a brief opportunity for Q&A. Then we've got a half-hour break to digest what you've heard so far and also digest some cake or something like that. And then after the break, we're going to go into a more in-depth focus on 2 key sections of the guide given by Dione Hills from Tavistock Institute and Helen Wilkinson from Risk Solutions. So I'm going to pass over now to my colleagues Alex Penn and Ian Christie from University of Surrey, who are going to start us off with an introduction to complexity. What is complexity and why do we need this guide on it?
Thank you, Martha. Okay, so first thing to say is that Ian and I are going to give an introduction to what is complexity, and the first thing that I always say is, well, we don't talk about complexity. So I prefer to talk about complex systems. I think that's easier than the nebulous sort of complexity concept. What we're interested in are systems that are meaningful to us in our policy making, which display some of the properties of complexity. So these are complex systems, systems of many diverse interacting parts, which have non-linear, that is non-proportional interactions between them, and in which the interactions matter. We can't understand the systems by looking simply at their parts. And for the most part in these systems, the components themselves adapt or learn in response to intervention. So examples would include ecosystems, economies, societies, cities, industrial networks, and the combinations of any of those things. And all social systems are complex systems. So we contend, in fact, that all policy has to deal with complex systems. And so it's vital that we develop the methods to allow us to deal with this. So a useful distinction, I think, is sometimes made when we're talking about complexity. We're not talking just about things that are complicated. So there's an idea of simple problems, things like following a recipe where you have a few components, but if you follow the steps accurately enough, you're pretty clear that you'll get your cake out at the end. This is contrasted with something complicated, say the Apollo missions to the moon or building a rocket. Here you've got very many parts, and they're all interacting, and you need to understand all of the parts and their interactions. But if you have a good knowledge of those parts, of the large scale of that complicatedness of that system, you can get the outcome you want. You can get a rocket onto the moon. Dealing with complex systems is more like bringing up a child, or you can do your best, but there are no hard and fast rules. You're interacting with a system that has its own dynamics. So you can guide it, maybe, and steer it, but you can't be confident of what the outcome is. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Alex. Stephen just mentioned the idea of wicked problems, and that there's a big overlap between the idea of complex systems challenges and wicked problems. And there's even an overlap with babies, actually, because having been doing a lot of babysitting as a new great uncle, I can say that sometimes feels like a wicked problem, not just a complex one. But this idea of wicked problems has got a strong overlap with complex systems, and many of you will be familiar with that idea. And a wicked problem is one which is persistent, maybe over decades, sometimes over centuries, something which seems to be policy resistant, solutions resistant. It's got many different dimensions to it, and it is inherently complex. So let's look at some examples of those sorts of problems, complex system policy challenges that are facing us all right now. And if we look down that list, you'll see that actually these are at the core of many government agendas. And it's really important to note that when we think about complexity, we're not thinking about something which is a marginal topic, something which is a small subset of overall policy problems. You could even argue complex systems challenges are the norm. They're the main thing that governments and all their stakeholders are mainly dealing with. So here's a list of some of the big challenges we can see emerging at the moment. Getting to net zero, greenhouse gas emissions. The organisation in charge of this building, the Church of England, has just set itself the target of getting to net zero by 2030, well ahead of all the other main policy targets to do with net zero. That will present an enormously complex policy challenge to the Church of England. Adaptation to climate disruption, the way in which we're thinking now about highly complex adaptation to a post-Brexit land use strategy involving trade-offs between food production, environmental protection, climate adaptation, the needs for housing, the need for infrastructure. All of that amounts to a complex cluster of challenges overlaid on top of many persisting wicked problems from the past. We've got new industrial strategy being developed. We can foresee coming down the track new waves of automation and artificial intelligence, which will have a lot to do with that industrial strategy. And we can also see a long-term persistent problem with social care and how that interacts with health services. And we can also see interactions emerging between all of these areas. And to take any of them seriously means having a grip on how it interacts with all the others. They also interact with unpredictable events which come out of the blue at us, coronavirus being a case in point. Howard Macmillan, when asked famously what had influenced his premiership most, he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And events will come out of the blue and start interacting with the complex interactions which are already going on between these different policy domains. So that's the nature of the complex policy challenge that we face all the time. And as I say, this is not something which is marginal in policy making. This is what it's normally like. And complexity gives us a vocabulary and a toolkit to deal with that. The kinds of challenges we face are that we're dealing with systems, social systems, but also ecological social systems and their interactions, which we can't ever fully know. So we're always going to be living with uncertainty. And complex systems, and Alex will make this point very strongly when she goes through the features of complex systems in a moment. They're dynamic. So when we intervene, they don't stay still and remain in the state that we want them to be. They will keep evolving. We also have to deal with the legacy of what decisions have been in the past, so we can be locked in to particular ways of behaviour, particular infrastructures, and that becomes part of the complexity that we have to cope with. There's also the issue that in policy making with complexity in mind, often we are not dealing with problems which can be solved, where we can say, having applied some interventions, we'll get to a point when we can say that that problem is now dealt with. Often, this is especially going to be true, I think, with climate change, we're looking at a predicament. In other words, a new state of affairs with which we have to cope. And we can do that well, and we can do it badly. But it's more like a predicament than something we're going to definitively solve. And that means often we're thinking about how we can manage and steer systems rather than bring them to a particular state, which we can say is a resolved condition. So how can we approach all of this? Well, this is why the guide we think is important. It's important not just for policymakers designing policy and for evaluation, but also for policymakers thinking about how we cooperate and co-produce solutions or coping mechanisms or steering mechanisms to handle these kinds of deep, complex, wicked problems. So we hope that the annex on complexity will have resonance way beyond government to many stakeholders. Now, Alex will go through some of the details in this complex-looking, intimidating-looking checklist of properties of complex systems. It's a really useful guide. It's not exhaustive. There are other features as well, but we think we've captured here some of the key features. And before Alex does that, I'll just highlight how some of these features, such as uncertainty, feedback loops, and emergence, relate to a couple of challenges which we now face in government. So one of them is to do with climate disruption, which we've already mentioned. Climate disruption features in a pretty alarming way feedbacks, positive feedback loops, where one development makes the underlying problem that you're facing worse. So the melting of Arctic ice because of global heating makes more heating more likely because more solar radiation is captured. Loss of forests makes further loss of forest more likely. Complex social ecological systems under pressure from climate disruption are likely to head towards tipping points, where we go from a fairly benign or at least capable situation to one in which we're in real trouble. And we often don't know when we're going to reach those points. We also don't know whether a particular input into the system is going to produce a fairly linear response or an unpredictable, non-linear one. And we face many unknowns. We have to take action in the face of ignorance, which will never be entirely reduced. And in some of these respects, we don't want to find out exactly what will happen. We do not want to get to the point where we know exactly what will happen if the climate system is pushed to a particular stressing point. So we always have to live with modelling with uncertainty. And we know we need to act at multiple scales. So this is a classic case of a complex system challenge. One of the responses we might offer to that, much discussed at the moment, is the idea of nature-based solutions to climate change, and as an emergency response, geoengineering. But in those cases, we're up against other factors in complex systems, such as unpredictability. We do not know what will happen if we do something unprecedented, like trying to create a new ecosystem, like trying to engineer the climate. There will be unknowns. New things will begin to emerge, which we hadn't predicted, which our models may not capture fully. So all of these features are right there, staring us in the face when we look at complex policy challenges, such as climate disruption, and the responses we might make. So emergence, uncertainty, tipping points. These are not exotic things. These are there embedded in mainstream policy challenges. And I'll hand over to Alex now to go through other features of complexity.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm just going to, you've got in front of you a list, I think, of some of the features of complex adaptive systems, and we go over some of this in the guide. I'm just going to whiz through a couple now. So with an attempt to give you a bit of a handle on some of the things that we think are properties of complex adaptive systems. So Ian has just mentioned some. So first and foremost, I think it's really important in government to think about the fact that complex systems are open systems. That means that your problem or the system that you're interested in will have many connections outside the boundary that you may have defined for it. So a kind of very pertinent example of this is in delayed transfer of care. So a patient may be ready to leave hospital, still occupying a bed. However, the social care system and problems of capacity in the social care system is responsible for a very large proportion of those delayed transfers, not the NHS itself. Just by thinking about the NHS as a system and not its connections to the social care system and broader community, you wouldn't be able to actually determine what was going to happen. It's very difficult to set your boundaries in these systems, and really importantly, for the most part, the boundaries of the problems and the challenges that we're facing don't correspond one-to-one with departmental or policy team boundaries. So we need to reconceptualize where our boundaries are. So you need to think about what your system is connected to. And this is a big cause of the uncertainty in complex systems, because we don't actually necessarily know what these connections are until they make themselves apparent by happening. Complex systems are constantly changing, as Ian mentioned, so they adapt under their own dynamics and in response to the interventions that we make with them. That means that the rules of the game essentially change as we play it. So new technological and social developments are constantly having to drive policy change. So social media, mass availability and use of individuals' data, and globalization combined have completely changed the landscape within which we have to make policy on issues around privacy and economy. And even, I think, I heard some interesting speculation this morning on whether Uber drivers and others on these kind of 0 hours contracts within the digital economy, whether they would self-isolate, whether they'd be able to afford to self-isolate in the case of an outbreak of coronavirus in this country. So the boundaries of this system, the digital economy and our response to a pandemic, might actually be overlapping in ways that we don't expect. Complex systems have huge numbers of relationships within them. That's the definition almost of a complex system, that you have many interacting parts, but these interactions have structure. So there are parts of a complex system that may be more influential than others. So levers or hubs, they may be key individuals in a social network, or they may be factors through which many causal flows move in policy. These things can actually be things that we can exploit in policy design, or they may be things that make us vulnerable to change in one external factor. The classic, of course, is emergence in complex systems. So the emergent properties of complex systems. This means that the parts of a complex system, they interact together to give rise to new properties that we couldn't predict simply by looking at the components. So you couldn't predict your personality and consciousness from looking at the neurons of your brain. Similarly, one can't predict what the resilience or fragility of a financial system or an ecosystem will be simply by looking at the component species. It's an emergent property of interactions. So in policy, in economics, we're always having to deal with emergence, and we may be trying to create it when we're talking about market formation. And we will often need new regulation to protect us from the consequences of emergent properties in systems. Constantly undergoing adaptation in complex systems. So any social components in complex systems, people learn, biological components adapt and evolve. So this is the evolution gives us bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics, and as the selection pressures change, bacteria change in different ways. Clearly, we've just seen a mutation event in which a virus has passed from an animal vector to a human, so adaptation clearly matters. And of course, individuals may try to game the systems in response to policy interventions, using interventions or responding to them in ways we didn't expect. Feedback loops Ian also mentioned, and he mentioned many examples in climate change, so I won't go through that too much, but simply to say that we might expect change to be accelerated or to be suppressed in systems. We shouldn't just expect a linear response to changes that we make. Which takes me nicely to non-linearity. I think we've gone over that a little bit, but essentially interactions between components in complex systems are not simply proportionate. So when we introduce a new product into a market, it may be slow to take off, it may accelerate and then saturate. We don't expect to see a linear response to change. We don't expect to see a linear response to change in number of new cases either in coronavirus. I think one of the key things that we've worked with in our systems mapping with different government departments has been trying to look at unexpected indirect effects. This connects back to the openness of complex systems, and it's something that we can really get a handle on by just bringing people together and thinking about what the systems look like. So essentially we have long causal chains in complex systems and long interconnections, which just thinking from our own silo, we may not be aware of. So there are many examples of this coming up in policy. The interaction between changing agricultural practice, increased winter planting, climate change, such more extreme weather events, and housing policy allowing building on floodplains has probably reduced resilience to flooding in rural communities. This is not something that people planned. It's an indirect effect of multiple policy and social changes happening. We must be aware that when we make change in a system, a change in one part of the system can lead to a large change somewhere else that we didn't expect and we didn't even know was connected. Right, I think I'm running out of time here a little bit, so I'll take you on to the last slide. So there's all these properties. There's a few I've skimmed over there, but there's many different properties of complex systems. There's many more in the guide you've got in front of you. But what's crucial to remember is that this matters for evaluation. We think that complex systems present unique evaluation challenges. And what we're aiming to do in this document is not just say, what is complexity, how can you spot it, but to try to connect tools and solutions to these properties. But there are these really key challenges, I think. So complex systems have multiple interactions and influences, and that means that we have often, very often indeed, long indirect causal chains linking our inputs to our impacts. Systems are in continual change, and they may resist change. And this may mean that we need to adapt. The objectives, design, and data requirements may change over time. We have to be responsive to the dynamics of the system because they are inevitable. This also, of course, means that the program may not reach a final state by the time the evaluation comes to an end. These systems are open, and that really means that context matters and that history matters. It's very hard in a complex system to establish a clear boundary and to say what exactly is going to be impacted by an intervention, what you need to consider. It's very difficult also because of this context dependency to standardize interventions, and outcomes may vary from one context to another. Of course, because these are social systems, and the data or the understanding of the systems is held amongst multiple different stakeholders, we need data from multiple different sources and informants to get a real understanding of the complexity. The nature of change in these systems is unpredictable. It's non-linear. There may be feedbacks accelerating change or suppressing change. We don't expect to see straightforward responses to our interventions. So, and indeed, we see emergent effects that no one had thought of at all in advance. Our evaluation plans may thus need to change to address the emergence of unexpected features, the uncovering of indirect effects, and we may need new methods to look at causality and attribution because we may have multi-causality in these systems, multiple possible causes. And finally, as probably apparent from just listening to all that, complexity is difficult to communicate. So it can be difficult to talk about, what is it? These are not kind of common sense, commonly held understandings of the world. So there may be difficulties in communicating methodology and findings. They may not fit into our current understandings of systems. But what we're trying to do here in this guide and throughout all of our work in CECAN is to try to, rather than just present this overwhelming complexity, which I think it can be overwhelming, we've got these huge complex systems out there, we want to move from overwhelming complexity to actionable complexity, to provide you thoughts, narratives, tools to allow you to start to get a handle on complex systems. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Alex and Ian. We'll have a chance to ask some questions in a second. What's inside the guide then? Well, the supplementary guide explains what complexity is and its implications for policy and evaluation. And most importantly, how evaluators and policymakers can plan, deliver, and use complexity-appropriate evaluation to work with this complexity. This is a nifty little A5 flyer that we've produced that explains, it's to promote the guide and explain what's inside. You'll each be getting one. The guide is divided into 4 main sections. So we have what is complexity, which is, as Alex has just summarised now, it's an accessible introduction to complexity and why it matters for policymaking. It describes and illustrates the properties of complex systems with images, definitions, and examples. The challenges of complexity to evaluation, the second chapter, illustrates why and how complexity makes evaluation more difficult or can make it more challenging. And it provides some examples as well. Then we get into commissioning and managing evaluations. So how planning and managing can help to understand, anticipate, and navigate these challenges that surround complexity. And finally, selecting complexity-appropriate approaches, which kind of does what it says on the tin. It gives some suggestions about how to approach choosing the method or combination of approaches for a particular evaluation. So, yeah, it's 4 chapters, but I do like to think of it as 2 parts. The first part being the first two chapters, which is sort of what you should know about complexity and why it's important. And then the second the final two chapters are what you can do about that. So Alex and Ian have just given you a sneak peek into some of the key points from part 1, chapters 1 and 2 of the guide. And Helen and Dione after the break will give us some insights into 3 and 4. But I'd first like to take a moment to highlight 4 parts of the guide in particular. These are my personal picks of some of the best bits, so bear with me. The first one you've seen a little bit of already, and there's a sort of version of it in your packs that Alex referred to earlier. In chapter 1 of the guide, you have this really wonderful table of images and examples to illustrate the properties of complex systems. This is just a snapshot. There are 11 properties in total that we've ended up describing and illustrating in the guide. On the left of the table, we have the properties that complex systems might exhibit, with images that we used to help try and communicate complexity that we produced with the help of one of CECAN's fellows, a design expert. There's then an accessible definition to try and explain what that property means. And finally, some examples of that property in action in different settings. So we have examples from the natural and social worlds and also from policy. So this table, these examples, these are really useful for recognizing and communicating with others about complexity. Use them to help you identify whether and which complexity properties might be present in the system that you're working with or the policy domain that you're working with. And use the pictures and examples to talk to others, so policy leads, analysts, evaluation contractors, evaluation stakeholders, about complexity in more concrete terms, rather than just saying it's difficult or it's complex. The second highlight I'm going to pick out is from chapter 3 about commissioning and managing evaluations when working with complexity, which Dione will be talking about later. A highlight for me is at the end of this chapter, a really handy list of questions that commissioners and managers can use to aid planning and management of evaluations. And that's split up into each section of the evaluation process. So you've got understanding, design, conducting, using, and disseminating findings. So these are just some of the examples of the types of questions or prompts that commissioners and managers are encouraged to consider. So things like, for example, to what extent does the policy or program or its context demonstrate any of the features of complexity? And we'll develop on those in the future questions about how you might want to think about addressing those. If this is the type of thing that you're interested in, I'll just do a little plug. I strongly recommend taking a look at DEFRA's Complexity Evaluation Framework, the CEF, which was published in January this year. Although it's specifically tailored to DEFRA's policy domains and way of working, I think it's a very useful reference for those of you who are interested in more along these lines. It has a really detailed list of questions and considerations for commissioning and managing evaluations, and it's supported all the way through with a lot more links to further information and key tools and resources. You have an A3 summary poster in your packs. That's just a short summary of the CEF, but the really detailed guide is online, and do come and find me if you want to have a link to that. So highlight 3 comes in chapter 4, which is about selecting complexity-appropriate approaches. We'll be hearing more about this from Helen after the break, but this chapter contains 3 really fantastic tables for those who are interested in selecting approaches that are complexity-appropriate. One table matches evaluation questions with methods and approaches. So you have the evaluation questions on one side, and the relevant methods and approaches on the other, and the benefits associated with those. A second table does the same. We've got the complexity challenges this time, on such as sensitivity to context, and these are paired up with the methods and approaches that can help to address those. And finally, there's a table which sets out the different methods and approaches, and it looks at what conditions can improve or worsen their feasibility. So, for example, configurational approaches are more feasible if you have consistent information for a number of factors, and less feasible if you have fewer than 5 or 10 cases available for analysis. And then for each approach, it indicates what resources and skills, specialist skills, you might need for each of those methods or approaches. So 3 really, really interesting tables for those who are interested in how to select approaches that are complexity appropriate. A final highlight I want to point out in the guide is actually at the end of the guide, after all of the main meat. I just want to point out that the guide has some links to further guidance and resources in the appendices. They're both general and sector-specific resources. They've got links to more information about methods and approaches. And then there's also links to practitioner guides and a few really useful academic articles, if that's your thing. So wrapping up, the supplementary guide is written for analysts and evaluation practitioners, both inside and outside of government. But crucially, it's also for policymakers, policy team leaders, as well as anyone commissioning evaluations. This really should be embedded throughout the process when you're working with complexity. You need to be aware of the importance of evaluation and how to manage evaluation and feed it into ongoing development and implementation of your policy. It's designed to be used alongside the 2020 revision of the Magenta Book. Use it when your policies, programs, projects, or their evaluations are particularly challenging, intractable, wicked, or complex. And it's published, we just heard, hopefully on the 26th of March this month and launched the next day by Treasury. And you can use a link on the back of the promotional flyer that's in your packs, which from the 27th of March will redirect you to the supplementary guide. So thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Daria Sobulska. I'm the Director of Programs and Evaluation at Wikimedia. I have a question. This might be included, but I haven't heard it. I'm of the belief that your kind of values and worldview really plays into how you make decisions in a complex system because of how it's unknowable. You kind of reach to yourself to make some of the decisions. But I think there is a risk there because you influence the decision that you make. So I wonder if in the guide there is some sort of, I don't know, acknowledgement or provision or explanation of how to deal with that, if that makes sense. So, or maybe how to bring diversity of views for more robust decisions in the system. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm glad to say there is. So that comes in the managing and commissioning section, part 3, which, and it's something that we really did have to grapple with, because when you're talking about evaluation approaches, there's this challenge of objective versus subjectivity, and in fact, with complexity, it is so important to bring in a full diversity of views. So we do tackle that, and I might leave that to Dione to draw on in the next presentation, if that's all right.
Hi, I'm Sally Bell from Macmillan Cancer Support. I've got a question which I don't know whether I'm preempting again what might be coming after the break. But it's a question about the need to be responsive to changes in the systems and account for that when you're planning and sort of commissioning evaluation. Because obviously we all work within budgetary constraints, time frame constraints, those sorts of things. So I don't know if you've got any advice about things like reconsidering data collection processes or things like that partway through an evaluation.
I think, again, I'm going to jump the gun if I talk about this, but this is a key part of the guide and everything that we try to reiterate throughout the guide. I don't know if anyone would like to say anything now, but I think it would be best to keep it for the later presentations. I'm really sorry.
I will say something about that later, but it's a very important point. Thank you for raising it.
Hi, Laura Vanning from National Community Fund. I just wanted to ask, well, thank you for the presentation. I think it was really useful and really interesting, and I'm so pleased that this is being published. But I wondered if there's anything around like next steps in how, I guess, you publicise this work and you encourage people, I guess, particularly within government, to take note of it, but also more broadly. I don't know if there are next steps around that to actually encourage people to engage with it.
It's a very, very good point. I think ourselves being aware of the complexity of how things work, we felt quite hypocritical just producing a guide and expecting that it would be taken up. So this event and a couple of other things that we're doing are part of helping to promote the work that we've done. So we're also going out to evaluation practitioners through the UK Evaluation Society. We're doing another event just like this up in Birmingham to reach out to others and target it a little bit more at local authorities and others. We, through the work that CECAN does, also does a lot of work directly with government and specifically with certain policy teams that have had challenging problems. And so a lot of the work that we've done has already been championing the kinds of things that we're saying in this guide. So really, I guess over the next few months, we'll be thinking about how CECAN goes forward from here and what new collaborations there could be to continue to build on that work and sort of further help to integrate all of this new thinking into how things are done.
Well, I mentioned earlier, we've got our launch on the 27th. We've also got a launch in the north of England in April and two launch events in Scotland. And really what we're trying to do is encouraging all departments to host events internally and to share this with their own stakeholders, with their own contractors. And I think this... and we're planning to go to the UKES later this year. So I think this is the start rather than the end of any process, I would say, in terms of cross-government evaluation group.
Just to say that we're also developing a package of training events that can be tailored to different organisations, which hopefully will be sent out to all of you as we have your email address as soon as it's finalised. And just particularly, I mean, to say that we're now currently also doing work on the role of complexity for funding agencies, charitable funding agencies, which might be relevant to yourselves.
Hello, I'm Raquel de Luis from Ipsos Mori. My question is about the principles that you have used to define complexity. I think well, from the presentation here, I think it is really relevant that you have conducted this work. And I wonder whether you could explain a bit better how you came up with all these principles, because I suppose it has been quite an iterative process. So it would be really helpful to know how you involved different stakeholders and the process by which you finally came up with the final list and definitions.
Yeah. So I'll have a go and then Alex can correct me if there's anything I've missed. We started off with, being some of us academics, we started off with a literature review. So we looked at what was already out there, both in the academic literature and also in practitioner guides that goes quite a lot in health community and in the international development communities that have done a lot of work on this already, and we were not wanting to reinvent the wheel. So there was a small team of us who reviewed all of that and looked. One of the things that we were looking for was how is complexity defined by all of these different people and pulling out the different characteristics. We did then consult, we went through various iterations both with the much wider CECAN team, looking for examples of these types of complexity, drawing on real examples and properties of complexity from the work that we were doing with government, these sort of case studies that CECAN has been doing. And over time, it was highly iterative. We kept coming back and kept trying to say, well, what is it useful to describe? And just as Alex said, we've not done all of them, but in the guide, we've picked out 11 that we think are particularly common and challenging. Is there anything that I've missed? And of course, we did have an advisory group comprising people from government and other evaluation communities and other important stakeholders who looked through the whole guide and helped to work with us to make it more relevant and challenge us on certain things, which was always very useful. Yes, I think, is there anything that you'd like to add, Alex?
Oh, I mean, we could talk for a long time about that, but I think because there are also many fields that work on complexity or complex adaptive systems, and I think the decision to look at complex systems rather than complexity, which could really encompass a lot of very mathematical work, well, essentially, or things like deterministic chaos and things that were going to be difficult for us to encapsulate, make meaningful. So we decided to focus on systems and what properties systems might display, and there are many properties that you could list, and there's a difficulty in that a lot of these are essentially sort of mathematical concepts, and so actually transferring them into this form, there's always a little I don't know, a little sort of perspective shift that you have to make. So some of them do actually overlap quite a lot. So feedbacks, tipping points, attractors, all of these things are actually aspects of different, the same sorts of properties of dynamical systems, but we've pulled out things in a way that we thought made sense in terms of their implications in policy or in social systems, and the things that could be in some sense actionable. And there were many, many things that we excluded also, because we had to sort of come to an agreement on what we thought was useful. But it's really this kind of idea of what properties do systems display that we're interested in, and what might be actionable and understandable. But if a mathematician, well, some of us are mathematicians, but it's been an interesting process of trying to narrow that down and trying to sort of meet the needs of those working in the social sciences and the complexity in mathematical sciences. But really, usability is what we've focused on for that.
Andre Horvath from Technopolis. Thank you very much. I've really recognized the value of this work as an evaluator, and from the perspective of sharing the challenges that we face with our clients. And I was wondering, just this is really useful to have the framework, and coming from innovation policy and national innovation systems is kind of something that's really close to me, and kind of understanding problems. But I was wondering whether there's anything in the guidance that points out really good examples of how evaluations have dealt with complexity, especially in terms of justifying the approaches that we're proposing for some of our work right now.
So that's an interesting question. One of the things, actually, just to sidestep a second, one of the things we found quite difficult in trying to write up the guide, and something we were looking for, was examples of evaluations that had failed, that had not managed to account for complexity, and where things had gone wrong, to help us show where complexity causes an issue, to help illustrate the need for the case. And that, I think, is a little bit around culture of not talking about our mistakes or failures. But in terms of good examples of how evaluations have dealt with complexity, I think the strongest thing that we have, there are some examples peppered throughout, but I think the best thing that I'd direct you to is the resources that we have at the very end of the supplementary guide.
And I mean, I would also welcome to kind of have a conversation with you, because I've worked with, when I worked in Ipsos Mori with the DFT, for example, and the evaluation of roads reform, which was a really complex policy area, and so
Great.
Extend and.
But at the end in the resources section, there are a couple of recommendations of different resources to look at, and practitioner guides that do propose further good ways of dealing with complexity, which is a lot where we've drawn our inspiration from.
Thank you.
Andrew Jarvis, my CF. I just wondered whether anybody had asked you to take this framework up the policy-making pipe a bit, because you're talking about applying it to evaluations, but presumably quite helpful if this understanding of system complexity informed the design of the intervention in the first place.
I think this is, we're all with you. We're all 100% with you. I think this was something that we talked about a lot, and we've tried a couple of times to just sort of hint at that, saying that this guide isn't just for evaluators and evaluation practitioners, but for the policy team leads, for those other types of people. I talked about how 4 years ago we thought it would be wonderfully impactful if we could get something about complexity into the Magenta Book. I think we realized very soon after that, actually, what we wanted to do is take the Magenta Book and take the Green Book and completely mix them up and put it all together and reimagine the policy cycle so that evaluation is running alongside development and implementation of policy in this adaptive way that we find is necessary when you're working with complex systems. So I 100% agree with you.
What I was kind of hinting at when I said in my introduction that CECAN is looking to wider horizons. Let me thank all our speakers. I think just to conclude that I think one of the things that should be fairly obvious is that the whole the supplementary guide is the result of a long process, an intellectually stimulating and sometimes frustrating process, I might say, trying to understand what all this was about, and I think we've got somewhere towards that. Let's stop there now for a networking opportunity, which is another complex system, over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, which is through the double doors at the end, and we'll resume here to hear about managing such complex evaluations at 3:30. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to Stephen too.